Okay, excellent. Good morning, everyone. So we looked last week at a little bit around the life of Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi and explored his history. We're talking about a couple of generations pre-Rambam, and yet in many ways it's useful to artificially construct the Kuzari in conversation with the Rambam. The Rambam was the fullest expression of a trend anyway that was taking place in Spain in the golden age of Spain. And before that, as the Arab world, the Muslim world discovered the Greek thinkers and began engaging seriously with philosophy, Jews began trying to integrate philosophy into their Judaism, even Rav Saadiah Gaon much earlier. And the Kuzari really is a critique of that sort of pathway. He's, as we will see today, very aware of philosophy, has a depth of understanding of what the philosophical argument is, but basically in the Kuzari he wants to put forward that we should have a different relationship with Hashem. Why should we know God through speculation and philosophy when we can know him through personal encounter, which is really the Jewish story? So that's the thrust of the Kuzari. We discussed last week some of his other work, his poetry, his love of Eretz Yisrael, and him living there in that juncture of both the golden age of Jewish life in Spain, but also in many ways the same motive as the Rambam for writing his Moreh Nevuchim. The educated Jew is confused about what is our relationship to philosophy, and rather than taking the stance of Maimonides in his guide, in which he says, look, everything in Judaism is consistent with philosophy, and you don't need to feel there's a clash. The Kuzari sort of wants to undermine it from the start, as it were, and says, no, we've got a deeper source. We've got revelation. We've got something that comes before that. We spoke a little bit about his life, his journey to Eretz Yisrael, and the legends that surround that. And we then began looking at his great work, the Kuzari. We discussed a little bit about the Khazar kingdom and its famous conversion to Judaism, and what we know about that, very little. But the Kuzari adopts, the Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi in his work, the Kuzari adopts the structure of the Khazar kingdom's conversion to Judaism as a framework for a philosophical conversation between a king who's interested in exploring, a philosopher, a Muslim scholar, a Christian scholar, and a Jewish scholar, the Chacham, who not only swiftly moves the conversation onto Judaism, but then addresses inter-Judaism debate around the Karaite view, the rejection of Torah Shebaal Peh. So that's the structure of what we're looking at. Now, I want to ensure that this shir does not become a sort of lengthy learning through the Sefer Kuzari. That's not the purpose of this setting. So really what I'm going to try and do is just draw out a few highlights that I think are central to the thinking of Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, and then we'll move on to our next great thinker. So please forgive me, this is very much not a consistent working through a rather lengthy book written in Arabic that we have now in translation, translated by the same Ibn Tabun family who translate the Rambam's works of philosophy, by those Provençal Jews who exist on the interface between the Christian world and the Muslim world, and the Ashkenazi world and the Sephardi world, and are fascinated by these ideas. This is not an extended look at the Kuzari, but just trying to draw out some of his views. And what I do want to spend quite a bit of time is on the opening chapter of the Kuzari, because I think, as I said, this is underappreciated. And much of the rest of what he says has been extensively analysed, but I think it's important that we look directly on his opening chapter. So the first thing to point out is the king starts off as a pagan, and his rejection of his pagan life is axiomatic. The king turns to the scholars that he invites to his kingdom, the philosopher, the Christian, the Jew, and the Muslim, and his motive for his intellectual quest is a dream, as I said last week, in which an angel appears to him, and the angel says to him, your intentions are good, you're trying to live a good life, but your actions are not good. And it's amazing that we need to remember this is an artificially constructed book. This is not a book of history. So whenever Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi chooses to say something, he's saying it deliberately. He's not saying this happens to have been what motivated the king. He's arguing, and he's presenting this to the reader. He's saying to you, my interested Jewish reader, your rejection of pagan belief should be enough because there's an angel that appears to you in the dream and says to you, your intentions may be good, but your actions aren't good. And again, I argued last week that if the Kuzari means that the king has some form of prophetic revelation, then this is a very weak basis on which to start your whole book. You're building your whole work on the weakest of foundations, the thinnest of foundations. The king happens to have a dream which told him that what he was doing was wrong. How can you start a work based on that? What about the rest of us who don't have this dream? And the point is, the Kuzari is arguing that all of us have this dream. The dream is a subconscious voice. It's a messenger from God. An angel is simply a messenger from God. It's that which is divine within us, which tells us, come on, you know that paganism is nonsense. You don't need, in the Kuzari's view, in the very setting of the conversation, he's engaging in a very profound undermining of philosophy, even in the conversation itself. And he's saying, you don't need sophisticated analysis to tell you that you have to embark on a quest, not just for thoughts and intentions, but also for actions. You can't live a life in which you're just saying, I have good intentions, and you're not worrying about what your actions are. Obviously, a human has to live in accordance with actions. Now, this voice of the Kuzari of the angel in the Kuzari's head, in the king's head, is going to appear in round 1 of the debate also. So round 0 of the debate is the Kuzari, the king, embarks on a philosophical quest or a quest for meaning and purpose, and the spur inside him is this spiritual voice that says to him, you have to get on with life. You can't just live life aimlessly with this hodgepodge of pagan ideas that doesn't actually tell you how to live a good life. That can't be a sufficient way to live. I elaborated on this last week, so I'm not going to go through that again. So the king now turns to the most obvious first source, and that's the philosopher. And here the Kuzari really, in the space of basically a couple of pages, gives a very beautiful summary of everything philosophy has to say from a religious point of view. And the philosopher is representing the same Aristotelian, Neoplatonic perspective that we spoke about in the previous series. And the philosopher basically says the following, and the Kuzari gives a very succinct summary. He's well read, he's well versed in philosophy. When I spoke about his biography, we mentioned that in his childhood and youth, he engaged seriously in philosophy. Later on in his life, he has a teshuva process. We don't know exactly what his teshuva is for. Maybe it's because when he was younger, he got over-absorbed in materialism. Some of his poetry seems to indicate that he enjoyed life, and maybe he felt that was over-indulgence in life. We don't know. Maybe he regrets his philosophical pursuit. But he starts off really summarizing very beautiful the philosophical system, and let's just lay it out for the purposes of clarity. He says when Aristotle and Plato talk about God as the first cause, we need to understand they mean something very different to what us commoners generally mean by God. God isn't associated with will, with wants, because if God is above time and space and he's unchanging, then he can't have wills or wants. If he's perfect, there can't be things that he wants that he doesn't have, because that would indicate a lack. There can't possibly be knowledge of human activity because humans are constantly changing, and therefore God knowing different things indicates change with God, and God can't change. There can't possibly be communication with humans because, again, humans talking to God indicates change, and God can't change. There can't be tefillah or prayer because that indicates God altering his action, and God can't change. It indicates God being aware of what we say or do, and again, God can't change. There can't be prophecy or nevuah because, again, that would indicate God talking to human beings in a temporal manner. And again, God is perfect, he can't change. So when philosophers speak about God as the first cause, what they mean by that is that there is something beyond time and space, which is the cause of everything, but that can't be a free-willed agent in the way that Jews, Christians, and Muslims think of these ideas. So that's really a summary of the cold God of the philosophers, who is a first cause, but not a God who is a free-willed agent in the way that we conceive of him. And here already in the first sort of few lines of the Kuzari, he's plunged us right into the depth of the clash between the two viewpoints. And again, if we put him in conversation with the Rambam, really what he's saying to the Rambam is, you may be pretending to be a philosopher, and you may be sort of dressing up your thoughts in the language of philosophers. Kol hakavod to you, fair enough, but realize that on a most fundamental level, you're very profoundly disagreeing with the philosophers. because the whole beauty of a philosophical system is that it's rational, it's reasonable, it doesn't have the sort of erratic nature of a free-willed being. But we do believe that God is free-willed. We believe he's a free agent who chooses, who has Rotzen, and who has will. How does that will coexist with God being infinite and above time and space? Good question. It needs an answer. But we do believe that God has will, that God chooses freely. He chose to create humanity. He chose, as an act of loving kindness, to bring us into existence and to give us the gift of existence. And therefore, he has expectations of us, how we should behave. He has commandments, Sivurim, that he's able to give us. He communicates with humans and interacts with us in two directions. We're able to hear from him. He interacts and runs the world in accordance with our behavior. That's what it means to be a believer in God. Now, there is no deep analysis in the Kuzari, or for that matter, in the Nevuchim, as to how we resolve this problem of an infinite God existing and communicating with a finite universe. And the probable answer that the Kuzari would have given and that the Rambam would have given is that that once you're dealing with infinity, you're dealing with a breakdown in language and an inability of humans to reason, as we've discussed at length previously. The whole ability of philosophy, the whole ability of us to speak, to talk, is in our ability to deal with the finite, that which words can capture, that which is concrete, that which is delineable, that you can delineate. As soon as you're talking about God, pre-time and space, we can't delineate, and therefore it's almost ridiculous for philosophy to try and constrain this God with the concepts of logic and reason. Of course, the God who is above time and space is free, and there is no contradiction to that. Why should we come to a moment? Why should we limit God and restrict his freedom? We will look at that more deeply when, please God, we look at one of the Kabbalists in depth. And I appreciate, in a way, I'm mixing and matching genres over here, but the Rishonim don't, to the best of my knowledge, don't significantly focus on this point. They just say, this is where we disagree with the Greeks. And in a moment, we'll see why the Kuzari king accepts that argument and rejects the philosopher's worldview. Sorry, Andrew.
Just one that sort of clarified the question: can God make an object that's so heavy that he can't lift?
Yes, we spoke about that then, and we said that Rav Saadiah Gaon. So for those online, Andrew just mentioned something we spoke about a couple of years ago. Some of the paradoxes: can God make another God? Can God make a stone he can't lift? Could God have made a square triangle? And there's two levels really to answer that. One level is that the question is meaningless. This is Rav Saadiah Gaon, who we haven't looked at as a great thinker, but maybe we will, who says in his Emunah V'Deis, his book of belief and knowledge, that what you've basically said is, can God do, and then set a series of meaningless sounds. Can God create a chili? Well, what is it? I don't know, but can he create it? Well, you've just said syllables that have carry no content within them. The word triangle and the word square are both meaningful, but a square triangle is a meaningless phrase. It's a contradiction. A four-sided, three-sided object. It's a contradiction in terms. Can God, which is another way of saying an all-able being, make a stone that an all-able being can't lift? Can an all-able being a stone that is unliftable by a being that can lift the stone? Well, that's just a meaningless series of syllables. So that's how Rav Saadiah Gaon phrases it. What we said when we looked at that was to draw this to a greater layer of depth, in a sense, in which we said really the problem is that when you're talking about the rules of logic that precede creation, the rules of logic themselves are post-creation, post a finite world, and human vocabulary breaks down pre-creation. The whole of human vocabulary is our ability to navigate finite existence, not infinite existence. So that's, again, I want to emphasize, for the sake of intellectual honesty, because he doesn't say any of this. He just says that philosophers adopt a God that can't communicate to humans, is above time and space, is a first cause. Don't get confused by them calling that first cause God. They mean something very different to that which Christian, Islam, and Jewish faiths mean by God. And this God is, their God is, the Greek God is above time and space, can't communicate to humans, can't do miracles, can't respond to us, can't give, can't accept tefillah, and can't give instruction or tzivurim. And basically, the Kuzari's response to this is beyond dismissive. And he says, By the way, the philosopher does talk about living a good life in his response to the Kuzari. He says to live a good life means that we need to adopt good midot, we need to have nice character traits in order for them to facilitate intellectual pursuit. Again, not so different to the language of the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah and in his Moreh Nevuchim, and to actualize our intellect. Our intellect is potential. We need to actualize it, and when you actualize it, you connect to God. How do you connect to God? Because God is the realm of ideas. The closest we can get to God is to live in a Platonic universe of ideas where humans become concepts. Remember our discussion around Neoplatonism and everything to do with that. And the Kuzari's responses to all of this is basically very, very, very short. And he says, this doesn't answer my question because I had a dream in which an angel came to me and said, your intentions are good, but your actions aren't good. In other words, I don't need to engage with philosophy. I have within me a inner conviction and knowledge that humans have to know how to live. There has to be something beyond which tells us what to do more than just reason. What you've given to me is nice kavanah, but it doesn't tell me about masim. It doesn't tell me about deeds. So again, I can't emphasize enough how the Kuzari, which is an anti-philosophical work in a sense, it's a work about revelation, adopts as axiomatic his dismissal of the philosophical worldview. He doesn't engage with it in serious debate. He just says this is clearly wrong. It doesn't address the most fundamental human needs. It's obvious to all humans that we need meaning, we need purpose, we need transcendence, purpose beyond existence. And all the philosopher can suggest to you is purpose within existence. Just live, and we can give you tools to how to live your life to the best. Be healthy physically, be healthy mentally, be healthy emotionally, maximize your mind. If you may then live what we would call a good and moral life in a sense, because if you want to maximize your mind, you need to be humble, for example, so that you can learn from others. You need to not be lazy, because then you'll just become a couch potato. You shouldn't be violent, because then others will hurt you back. But that doesn't touch on a greater truth. We have within us, maybe let me use an example that's more relatable to. If someone suggests in this room that the only reason to be moral, the only reason not to torture small children for fun is utilitarian, because if I torture your children for fun, you may torture my children for fun. Or if I torture children for fun, I will suffer guilt, which will cause me suffering. In other words, the two theories of morality, of social contract or utilitarianism, again, I want you to understand what this is saying. There's no reason, if we don't believe there is something called the good and the bad, and that we ought to be good, then how do we explain morality? Utilitarianism, that being moral is the best way to live a happy life, or social contract, that if I torture your child, you might torture my child. If someone would seriously suggest those philosophies, and there are philosophers who suggest it, the correct response is, I know that that's nonsense. The repugnance I feel, the sheer shuddering revulsion at the concept of torturing a small child for fun, not just as a psychological revulsion, but the inner knowledge that there's something called wrong and right. It's just wrong to do that. It isn't just because of a social contract, because it's convenient not to do it. It isn't just because I might suffer pangs of conscience and therefore suffer from it. It's clear that this is wrong. It just doesn't make sense to the human condition. Something like that is the Kuzari's response to the philosopher, which is all your philosophical reasoning is very clever, but it just doesn't fit to the inner knowledge we have that there is something called transcendence, there is something called good and bad and wrong and right, which is more than just creation itself. Are you with me in this? It may be hard to respond to the philosopher, other than to say, I can't take you seriously. I don't know how to take someone seriously who can look me in the eye and say, I can't really see anything wrong with torturing a child. If you could psychologically rid yourself of the guilt of doing it, and there'd be no social contract, and you could get away with it, and no one else would do it, there's no fundamental reason not to do it. It's just repugnant. It just doesn't seem true to the very axioms of how we operate. It's analogous to, I'll answer in a moment, it's analogous to the problem of logic itself. Logic itself operates with axioms. If someone says to me, how prove logic, we can't do that. We only have the tools of logic to prove logic. What other tools could I use other than that? The axioms of logic, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Or if A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, then A is bigger than C, seem to be self-evident. They're just at the core of our existence. And with morality also, it seems to be at the core of our existence, axiomatic in a moral universe, that it just can't, like it logically impossible to sustain the idea that that A can equal B and B can equal C, but A doesn't equal C. And if someone says it to me, I just don't know what to do with it. I don't have anyone to converse with. Similarly, if someone says, I see nothing wrong with torturing a small child for fun. It's in and of in itself okay. I just don't know how to deal with the person. I need to come up with a label. I don't believe the person. I think they're psychopath, which is nothing other than there's something missing in their inner sense of self, their inner sense of awareness. It can't be. And that's really the Kuzari's response to the philosopher. What you're saying is profoundly nonsense. And that's the depth. So again, the very power, you can like or dislike the Kuzari, but the very power of the Kuzari is in how dismissive he is of this idea. He's making a point by not bothering to engage with this viewpoint. He says it's not a viewpoint that I'm seriously willing to engage with. It's clearly and self-evidently nonsense. You're very clever, you're very sophisticated, you've come up with all your clever arguments, but I know what you're saying is rubbish. In the same way as I think we ought, and I think, again, the Kuzari doesn't need my agreement, but I think he's right. We ought to say the same to the person who tries to be sophisticated about morality. There's so much interesting philosophical stuff to talk about in morality. I'm not dismissing that. But if someone simply says there's in and of in itself nothing wrong with torturing a small child for fun, that it's just about social contracts. It's just about psychological problems, my pangs of guilt and the like. That's clear. That deserves laughing out of the court. It deserves dismissal. Not a serious argument that we ought to engage with, and that's how the Kuzari gets his king to respond to. That's how Rabbi HaLevi gets his king to respond to the philosopher, and with that, the philosopher is ushered out of the court, out of the palace. Yes.
Would Plato and Aristotle, what the hell they were like? They say yes, that this is something very else.
We don't really know. Again, it's not. The Greeks spoke a lot about morality. The formulation I'm using, again, if for the sake of intellectual honesty, I'm being quite anachronistic over here. The Greeks spoke a lot about good and bad. They spoke. I shouldn't even speak about the Greeks. There's so many schools of thought within the Greeks. But Aristotle spoke about theology, the purpose of something. So he said, and we have this confusion to this day in English also, and in Hebrew in some ways. If I say a table is a good table, I don't mean by that a moral argument. I don't mean it's a kind table or a worthy table or something, or a moral table. I simply mean it tables well. It does what tables are meant to do. It fulfills well its function. And if I say it's a bad table, I mean it doesn't do well the job of being a table. So tables have aims, they have goals, they have purposes, which is to do whatever tables are meant to do. And a good table has to table away in a good way, has to give the function of tablism well, it has to provide that functionality. When I say a person is a good person, do I mean the same thing? Do I mean a person is simply an object with a certain functionality, and a good person means you do that functionality well or not? So there's a bit of a confusion of terms. It's widely accepted, actually, that Aristotle's this confusion of terms and Aristotelian theology and his sort of idea of everything having a purpose set back intellectual Western thinking for about 2,000 years. It was one of the less positive legacies of Aristotle, this confusion. It gets down to another idea that we often speak about from the sort of pulpit type drasha, and is a very important idea. When we say why is something the way it is, you need to really work out what do you mean by why. Do you mean for what, or do you mean what's the cause? If I say why does fruit exist, is the answer so that humans and animals can eat the fruit? Or is that the purpose of fruit? Well, neither, in some ways, evolutionary biology, for example, wouldn't say that. It would say that the fruit just happens to be because that's how it evolved. Even in evolutionary biology, is the purpose of the fruit to attract there's an evolutionary answer to why fruits are nice and tasty. So animals eat them, and the seed doesn't get destroyed by the digestive system, and then the animal deposits its waste somewhere else, and a new tree can grow in a fertile patch of soil, and a new tree can grow. Is that the purpose of the orange growing? Well, oranges don't really know purposes. So what do we mean by purpose? And when in Judaism we ask what the purpose of something is, we mean something very different to when a scientist asks, why does an orange go orange? Why do oranges exist? So we have to really question, whenever we talk about purpose and why, do we mean for what? In other words, what's it heading for? Or do we mean a question going to the future, or do we mean a question going to the past? And that whole confusion around purpose and direction is a mishmash that, to the best of what we can see, Aristotle didn't really distinguish between, and created a lot of confusion as a result of that. So just to summarize what I'm saying, this school of thought that the Kuzari is quoting as Greek philosophy, by which he means the Platonic Aristotelian mix that the Arabs inherited and that the Jews learned from them, as we discussed in the previous mini-series, doesn't really, in many ways, in at least as far as modern philosophy is concerned, misses something about what good and evil is, or what we mean by a good person. And the Kuzari picks up on that and is very dismissive of it, and just says you've sort of misunderstood what it means to be a person. I have a dream, and the dream told me I keep on hearing the angel of the voice of God speaking in my subconscious, telling me it's not enough to have good intentions in life. You have to do good stuff. And with that, he's dismissive of it.
Pascal's wager fitting quite nice with this discussion.
Pascal's wager, thank you for mentioning that, a very utilitarian view of religion. If religion is just about, but I should mention we have this mess in modern day Judaism also, and therefore thank you for mentioning that. You will hear people say that a proof for the Torah is that otherwise there's nothing that would stop you being a Nazi. In other words, without Torah there can be no morality. This is a profoundly untrue idea. It's not correct. It is true, you could argue, and in a way the Kuzari is arguing, that without belief in transcendence, without belief in God, without belief in spiritual dimensions existence, we may have trouble explaining morality. Even that needs exploration, but you could argue that. The idea that without Torah there's no morality finds no source in classic Jewish thinking. And on the contrary, we're told the opposite. Hashem could turn to the Dor HaMabul and say, what are you up to? You're engaging in Hamas. Well, why can't they respond to? Well, we never had revelation. We didn't have Har Sinai. He can turn to Paro and say, which sort of society enslaves strangers that comes to their land? And I'm now going to give you Makkos. Well, I don't know. I never had revelation. We do not find the idea that the Gemara says, Ilmoli nitna Torah, where the Torah not given, we could have learned some ideas about morality. So we don't find an idea that the sort of Kirov argument that you have to accept Torah because otherwise you would have no moral guidance. The Kuzari it can be misinterpreted as saying that. He's saying something subtly different. The Kuzari is saying that if you don't believe in transcendence, in a human beyond just the intellectual and the physical, then you've got a problem with morality. Even that one could debate, but that's the Kuzari's view. That the idea that you need revelation to be moral is not correct. The idea that you need revelation to be spiritual and transcendent, yes, absolutely. So, sorry, why am I looking at you? So, I mean, Peter reminded me of this. Sorry. So that's the first one. In response to your question, there is a version of mistake about that in a lot of modern Jewish conversation. And Peter is bringing something else up, which is, Peter's mentioned Pascal's wager, or the idea that you should believe because it's the better odds. I'll say Beauty Pascal's wager. Yes. If there is no God, how much of a price have you paid? You've sacrificed some little pleasures for 90, 100 years. How bad is it being a Frum Jew, right? How much can we not experience? And on the other hand, if there is a God and you haven't lived a Frum life, you've sacrificed infinite rewards in the world to come. That's Pascal's wager. The odds are if as long as you are in doubt about what to do, then better to live a religious life than to live an irreligious life. Now, there may be some truth to the argument or not, but the idea that religiosity can just be utilitarian and just lived in order to get rewards in the world to come, basically, the idea of a religious person saying to a non-religious person, be religious because you'll get rewards in the world to come, really is saying, you're right, the purpose of life is beef burgers. It just happens to be that I have a better recipe than you. In other words, the purpose of life is hedonistic and pleasure. It happens to be that if you believe in Olam Haba, you'll get more beef burgers by keeping halacha than you, poor fellow, who won't get that many beef burgers. So it's worth sacrificing the cheeseburger made of ham, so you don't have cheeseburgers of ham for 70, 80, 90, 100 years, that's a big deal. And for that, you'll get an infinite life of beef burgers. That's really, if that's your version of Judaism, then you're missing again what the Kuzari is saying. I'm not even sure if you have that worldview. That's a terrible view of what it means to be a human being. So utilitarianism, this sort of idea that this is a way of maximizing pleasure, misses the point. It's not grappling with a real issue, that inner voice that we have inside us that tells that's axiomatic. It's as axiomatic as the voices of logic. And it tells us, no, this is not a reasonable way to live life. It's unreasonable to think that humans are just here to enjoy ourselves and stimulate nerve endings. There's a purpose and a transcendence and a meaning and a spirituality that you can achieve in your life that's beyond just existence. And the philosopher who's no hedonist, the philosopher might live a very ascetic life in which you're engaging in intellectual pursuits. But the Kuzari is saying to him, at the end of the day, you're not addressing this problem that I posed to you at the beginning, which is I hear inside me this ringing voice that says your intention is good, but that's not enough to be a human being. You have to know how to live. You have to know what to do. So yeah. Okay, so the question being asked is, for those online, is has the Kuzari created the straw man that's easy to dismiss? I don't think so. No, I think again, we're here presenting the thought of the Kuzari. One could look at things in different ways, but I think he's actually given a beautiful summary of first cause theology and what they had inherited of Aristotle and Platonic thought. I think the Kuzari is onto something over here. I think it's very what he's saying is amazing.
That would have been.
Yeah, he doesn't need my agreement, but yeah. Okay.
So that would have been the predominant view of that school of thought.
The Kuzari is arguing that philosophy by itself, this philosophical view by itself, is unsustainable, and therefore, why bother embarking on a project, which the Rambam later does, and in a different way Rav Saadiah Gaon has already done, of trying to align Judaism with Aristotelian Platonism? Why bother doing that? The whole endeavor is missing so much. And maybe I'll just mention it. I'll take this choice. The Kuzari is not anti philosophy. He accepts that. I'm here now speaking about what he says in the first chapter and later on in his book, where he revisits science and so on. He's accepting of science. He doesn't have a problem with science. He's accepting, by the way, of the assumption of Rav Saadiah Gaon and the Moreh Nevuchim, that if you see something in the Torah that is philosophically provable as wrong or anti-scientific, we need to reinterpret the Torah to understand that. He doesn't have a problem with, for example, the Maimonides idea later expressed, that whenever the Torah talks about physical things like the hands of God, Yod Chazakos, the outstretched arm, Einei Hashem and the eyes of Hashem, all of that is anthropomorphisms, and it really means Dibra Torah Koloshim B'nei Adam. He doesn't have a problem with understanding that that's metaphor, is not to be taken literally. He even accepts that philosophy can give you some guidance as to how to build a just life. If you want to create a society that will be just, where we won't kill each other and we'll get on with each other, then the tools of philosophy work. His point is that philosophy offers proofs in mathematical and logical sense, in the mathematical sciences, but the mistake is to now think that just because there's proof in that world, therefore we should accept everything they say about metaphysics. When you enter into the world of transcendence, you have to acknowledge the free will of human beings, the human spirit's freedom, and the freedom of the creator. So he's arguing that algorithms, formulae, science can tell you that much about the physical world. It can even perhaps tell you social studies science, the science of how to run a society, how to build good politics. It can't tell you what it is to be a freely choosing human being who's given the gift of creativity and thus the gift of transcendence. And because he spells this out in his later sections, so he's well read, superbly well read in the same cultural environment as the Rambam and Rav Saadiah Gaon. He understands these ideas. He's simply saying that they're insufficient to explain the human spirit, and I don't think he's attacking the straw man. I think he's attacking I think it's a very good, real point that needs to be thought about. Otherwise, we wouldn't be reading him. Yeah.
The connection between thought and action.
Mm-hmm.
I was also talking about the limits of philosophy.
Yes. Yes.
That's in thought too.
So the reason the Kuzari is distinguishing thought and action is he's saying that instead of me engaging with philosophical dispute with you, I'm just going to say I don't believe this tells us how to live life. It's not sufficient in telling us how to live life. That's his argument. And again, I want you to understand we're engaging with this because we can't read a work like the Kuzari that's saying, I'm going to explain to the assimilationist Jew who's worried about Christianity, Islam, and philosophy, and I'm going to explain Judaism to you. And all he bothers doing with the whole rejection of paganism in round 0, and in round 1, the rejection of the philosopher is, I had a voice inside me that said, and therefore what you're saying isn't enough. He's saying this, his point is there's something so axiomatic, so basic, so fundamentally wrong with that worldview. It's completely missing the point of what a human being is and what a human being can achieve with their lives. I do think this is something that we Jews need to hear, and we need to hear in the modern age. Here again, I'm sort of in a way emphasizing this anachronistically because we're living again in that world. The danger, the gift of Judaism, and the danger to Judaism, and the danger to our lives really is to sink into a view, a materialistic worldview in which we're just basically a bit of biomass, obeying laws of science, acting with no free will, and just drifting through life in which the most we can hope for is our 100 years on Earth, maximizing some form of self-actualization, whether that's nerve endings or philosophical, intellectual actualization. It's profoundly soul-destroying. It's profoundly nihilistic. It's negative. It's not recognizing that which we most fundamentally know about ourselves, which is that we're free-willed agents. Again, if someone would come into this room and say, I have philosophical proofs against free will, or I have philosophical proofs against consciousness, our response should be, we know that this isn't true. It's axiomatically not true. Our inner knowledge is so fundamentally that this isn't the essence of what we are as people, that we don't need to engage with this seriously. It's a really interesting conversation. We need to know what to do with the research and how to answer it and how to respond to it, but it doesn't fit the very tools with which we use to navigate life and to navigate the universe. In the same way as if someone would deny the very fundamentals of logic, there's simply no tools with which to respond, because you're questioning the very tools with which we experience life. What would it mean to say these things are an illusion? Am I carrying people with me here, or? So this is the Kuzari's argument. I want to use the few moments available just to briefly dismiss Christianity, Islam, and then Judaism, because again, the Kuzari does that. He does it very, very briefly. The next figure to come in is the Christian scholar, and the Christian scholar says we basically believe in a creator that's eternal, but we think he created the world in 6 days. We think that he speaks to human beings. We think he shows his pleasure and his anger. We think there's prophecy. So I've answered all your problems with the philosopher. There is a God that we can interact with. And then he says he sent his son, born as a human being, who is the Messiah, who's the Son of God. He is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He quotes the founder of Christianity, who says, I came not to destroy one of the laws of Moses, but I came to confirm and enlarge it. And we believe in the New Testament and don't keep any commandments of the Old Testament. That's sort of the summary of the Christian. And the Kuzari basically responds, again, in a very short paragraph, and he says, I haven't heard anything logical over here. Next. And then comes the Muslim scholar. And again, quite literally, that's what he responds. So the Kuzari, very interesting, is not prepared to engage seriously with this theology. He says, you call yourself monotheist, and then you get into this tangle of whether it's one or three. You say that you believe in a God who's above time and space, and then you talk about God becoming embodied in a human being. You say that you believe in the founder of your faith not changing any of the laws. I'm only coming to add, I'm not coming to take away. And then you dismiss all the laws. I can't be bothered for this. And off you go. So again, very, very interesting summary of that. Then the Muslim scholar comes in. And again, don't forget, the Kuzari is structuring this in order. He chose, because this whole episode is a sort of literary device to put arguments forward. So he chose to put the philosopher first, then the Christian, then the Muslim. There's a hierarchy over here in what he's doing. The Muslim comes in and says, we like the Christians, we believe in a creator who speaks to the human beings, who has prophecy, who gives instructions, and we're proper monotheists. We believe in the unity of God. We don't get caught up in any of this Trinitarian mess. We absolutely reject embodiment, and any language used that is about physicality is a metaphor, like we Jews say, even though occasionally the Torah will use the language of in the hands of Hashem or the eyes of Hashem, we simply mean perception and action and so on. our prophet taught us all these things. He then mentions, and this I don't know enough about Islam to know if this is correct or not in all Islamic schools of thought. He mentions that the rewards of the pious consists of the return of the spirit to the body in paradise and bliss, where we never need to cease to enjoy eating, drinking, love of women, and anything we may desire. And the punishment is being condemned to the fires of hell and punishment that knows no end. I don't know enough about Islam to know if that's universal theology or if they meant that as metaphor also. We do have similar language occasionally here and there in Chazal, even though that's certainly not what we mean by the world to come and so on. And basically, the king says to the Muslim scholar, I hear this is all very nice, but do you have any proof for this revelation? And the Muslim scholar says no, but the language of the Quran is so self-evidently beautiful and spiritual that it speaks for itself, it sells itself. Now, again, I'm no expert on other faiths, so I need to be cautious over here. I should have said that, by the way, about Christianity also. Wars were waged over exactly what the Trinity means and how to resolve these things. There is a small branch of Christianity which is purely monotheistic. I think they call themselves Unitarians who don't believe in the Trinity and so on. But the predominant Christian faith seems to have this problem that the Kuzari identified, which is after 2,000 years, we still don't really know what it's saying and how it can argue it's both a monotheistic faith and believes in a God that can be embodied and take on a tripart identity and so on. So again, I don't know enough about Islam to comment on this, but the Muslim friends I've spoken to and the reading I've done, it does appear that basically Islam has two major pillars for its belief. The first, which the Kuzari, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't discuss, is the phenomenal military success that Islam saw in its early days. And the second is that the Quran is evidently the word of God. It's just, when you read it, you just know it's spiritual. It's so profoundly beautiful and incredible that you just know it's a spiritual faith.
Very difficult though with
the
facts that contain having Mary and all these things and down in Egypt where it's full with errors. So how could?
Okay, I'm just it maybe may not. I just want to go with the Kuzari's argument over here. So the Kuzari responds by saying that the Kuzari basically responds by saying that if that is the proof for Islam, that's not an objective proof, that's a subjective proof, and it isn't accessible really as an external verification. Now, I think he's saying a sophisticated point over here, which is you're arguing that it says the king, if I invested, at the moment now, when you read the Quran in a foreign language, you don't see an indescribable beauty to the work. You don't see a self-evident truth. Many Muslims have told me this, that if you understand classical Arabic and you can read it, it's indescribably beautiful. I have no reason to dismiss that. A lot of times, I mean, at the time of, they do it less now, but it was probably some level of sort of closet racism at the time. The time of the war with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, there was a lot of fun made of the sort of flowery nature of his rhetoric. And some of that was just cultural, almost xenophobism. A lot of stuff sounds silly when translated into another language. And apparently, the flowery language and the beauty of the poetry and the cadence and the rhythm of the Quran is indescribably beautiful. I've heard this from many people who I trust who say it's exceptionally beautiful. No problem with that, if that's the case. But the king says basically to the Muslim scholar, this isn't anything objective. And what it would demand of me would be to invest decades of my life to learn classical Arabic. And even then, I may never pick it up well enough to know and understand. And there's nothing that's enough of a spur for me to embark on this project in order to investigate the truth of your faith. So again, he's dismissive of Islam fairly swiftly by saying there's no external verification of this. And the only things you can come up with, he doesn't mention military conquest, is the beauty of the language of the Quran, which self-evidently is godly. To anyone who can only access it in translation, we don't see that. And it would demand of me to invest decades of my life to be able to access that verification. You can't have a faith built on which doesn't have anything arguing for it till you're willing to invest in it a lifetime of absorption in it in order to be able to subjectively mold your way of thinking through it. I don't see that as sufficient. Again, a very, very interesting argument to ponder. Does this
Corruption, it's the perversion of Ara.
There's truth in that, and Leonard again points out they've made questions around objective truth and so on. I'm not here in a sense trying to resolve these. I'm just saying that the point that Kuzari makes is, I think, an interesting point, which he sees as self-sufficient in itself, not to need to go further.
Yeah. You can't just convince about the sugar of the truth of Judaism by Gillette Garden. He's got to gradually immerse himself and keep Shabbos, keep everything in it.
Okay, we do speak about immersive Judaism, but we argue that there are enough objective facts to push one into immersing yourself in that life. If you really want to be absorbed in it and understand it, and you need to experience it on the inside, but there's enough to convince you that this is a worthwhile investment to make, a journey to embark on. I think it's true to say no one can really understand Shabbos until you immerse yourself in Shabbos. All you know about Shabbos is Mishnah Berurah. You're not going to find it particularly beautiful. But there's enough there to argue, this is the Kuzari's point, there's enough there to argue that one should immerse oneself in it. Again, I want to emphasize that in some level or other, there's been a lot of discussion since the Kuzari as to the whole, much of it generated by the Kuzari, as to what degree we should anyway be engaging in philosophical thought about truth and what does truth mean and things like that. But the Kuzari is the voice that's arguing move away from philosophy into an immersive Jewish experience, but he's arguing there's something that should motivate you to immerse yourself in that experience. And then he's going to, have the rest of his sefer in which he tries to capture the king's imagination about what that immersive experience would look like. But his dismissal of Islam is, if the only way you can get to it is to an immersive experience of the beauty of the Quran, then there's nothing further to talk about. There's not enough there that pushes me to do that. Yes.
Is Islam proof of this kind, which is very difficult to get? That is a thing, so they say, cannot be a proof for a religion. Cannot be.
I think he's arguing that there's a problem with building your faith on that. In other words, and therefore I'm not going to engage with it. The type of proof that can only be if you invest 20 years in learning Arabic and understanding, because it's not just enough to learn Arabic. You can learn Arabic, I assume, by online for within 3 weeks on sort of very basic level. That's not going to give you the proof. You have to understand the whole cadence and beauty of classical Arabic. That's such a difficult path, which involves 20 years of investment, that it becomes circular and self-convincing. That's not enough to create a belief system. There's a philosophical problem with it. Again, I want to emphasize over here that I am engaging in a degree of interpretation of the Kuzari through all of this. The purpose of this series is simply to give everyone a taster, and I'd encourage everyone to learn it themselves and to look at this. The Kuzari in what's there on the text simply says that the king of the Khuzars has a dream, and the angel appears to him. The philosopher says his philosophical argument, and the Kuzari says the angel already appeared to me, so I'm rejecting what he says. He doesn't elaborate what he means by that. The Christian speaks to him, and the Kuzari just says, I don't hear anything logical over here, and he doesn't elaborate further. The Muslim speaks, and all the Kuzari says, I'll just read out to you what he says in English. He says, although your book may be a miracle, as long as it's written in Arabic, a non-Arab as I cannot perceive its miraculous character, and even if it were read to me, I cannot distinguish between it and any other book written in Arabic language. And basically bring on the Jew. So I'm trying to understand what the Kuzari is doing over here. And my understanding is what I just said, which is, well, I mean, what's that sort of response? To go and learn Arabic for 20 years? I mean, a non-Arabic speaker can learn Arabic. The answer is the king is saying that, and there's nothing that you've given to me that pushes me to do that. That's not sufficient to give a proof. So I'm showing you my way of what I think is the correct way of reading the Kuzari. I'm trying to present it in what I think is a coherent manner. So yes.
Did Allah say you have to learn every single other Arabic piece of writing to know that this is special?
He doesn't. He says I can't distinguish with it and any other book written in the Arabic language. He may mean by that also to get the nuance of what's unique about it. You'd have to immerse yourself so deeply in another culture for so many decades. It's not an endeavor that there's not enough that can justify that investment, and therefore you can't found a religion or base a religion on that. That's the point he's making. Whereas he's going to argue that Judaism has enough going for it that then you should immerse yourself in it. He's all for immersive religious experiences, 100%. That's his whole book is written to say that Judaism should be immersed in. It's not just the gods of the philosophers. But he argues there's enough objective thought there to push you to immerse in it. Yes, and we'll see next week. He's going to do something very strange about Judaism also. The point I'm trying to bring out is that to me, in a way, the most interesting part of the Kuzari is these first few chapters, because everything he writes is counterintuitive. It's exactly not the way we would build a book of reason. The whole predicate of the whole philosophical journey is a dream the king has. The whole dismissal of philosophy is the dream. The whole dismissal of Christianity is a couple of lines of this is illogical, and the whole dismissal of Islam is a couple of lines saying there's not. He doesn't even spell this out. He just says, well, then I'm a non-Arab. I can't be bothered for this. There's nothing I can do. I can't get into that. I can't see it. And that's it. And then when he comes to Judaism, he's also going to present Judaism in a completely perverse manner almost. And again, he's choosing to put that in the mouth of his spokesman, the Chacham, and the king's going to laugh at the Chacham, by the way. The round one of Judaism, the king is going to say you're a fool. So we have to understand why the Kuzari structured that way, and that, please God, we'll do next week. So I just saw someone with their hand up in this one. Yeah. Okay. So that brings us to the starting point of next week, where now finally the Jewish spokesman has a chance to speak. And we'll look at that next week. And please God, we'll also look at some key highlights of the views of the philosophy, particularly around the uniqueness of Hebrew, the uniqueness of Eretz Israel, and the uniqueness of the Jewish people. And I hope that will give us a taste of what the Kuzari has to say. And I wish everyone a good day. Thank you so much for listening. Yes. Our next week is Rosh Chodesh. Okay, so our Shabbat Sunday, right? We announced it. Yeah. Okay, so we'll have to see next week what the timings are, or if there'll only be a share the week after next, because Rosh Chodesh. We'll have to see. Yes. Yeah.
I think it might be digressing.
Yeah.
This question that you asked about how we deal with how we know that inflicting pain on a child is wrong.
Yes.
Is that what the story of the Dor HaMabul is? And somehow we're, from a Jewish perspective, we sort of say that somehow in the soul, in the brain, there's something inbuilt that's right and wrong. And that the Dor HaMabul obviously went against that, and that was why the
one way of reading the Dor HaMabul is that the Dor HaMabul basically says, and Sodom maybe is similar. We have philosophy of might is right. Like what's wrong with that? Why should wealth be distributed by ownership, by who happens to legally have a right to it? Why shouldn't it be distributed by might is right? Why isn't that another way of doing it? If I'm stronger than you, so I can take your stuff, and that's just the way it is. But either way, the response to the Dor HaMabul is not revelation. The response to the Rambam is you should know that this is corrupt and perverse. You should have an inner voice, a moral voice that tells you this is wrong and inappropriate. Yes, there's within the human being a spiritual voice. That I'm arguing that this is the Kuzari opens off as a profound. The very structure of the Kuzari is a profoundly non-philosophical. He says, I'm not going to speak to you on your terms, in your turf. I'm going to speak in my turf. And in my turf, a human being has a spirituality within them that tells them that this is wrong. There's an angel speaking within you that says this is wrong. You can't live a meaningless life. You can't live an immoral life. There's an inbuilt spirituality within a human being. That's what the Kuzari is arguing. The very structure of the work is arguing that. I'm not going to go on your turf. I don't believe you philosophers. I've understood that. Yeah. Yes. Be kind and hevel. Absolutely. Yeah.